Some men raise a glass to celebrate. I raised mine to remember every word spoken about my daughter in a language nobody at that table thought I could follow. Keep it together. Dale. Just smile and pass the bread basket. That's what I kept telling myself across the table at Copperstone Grill, the restaurant out on Old Mill Road in Hartwell, that I'd reserved 6 weeks in advance because it had that particular kind of view. Long meadow, split rail fencing, and a creek bending out of sight behind the tree line. The kind of place that says we are not nothing without anyone having to say it out loud. I wanted Renault's parents to feel welcomed. I wanted them to feel like Hartwell. Tennessee wasn't just a patch of map between the coasts. More than anything, I wanted my daughter Cassie to look around that table and see everyone she loved getting along like it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't get that. What I got instead started with a comment about the fish. Dale. Is this the Chardonnay you selected? Philippe asked, lifting the glass and rotating it slowly in the low light, the way a jeweler examines something he's already decided to return. His accent turned every syllable into something official. In France. He told me. This varietal would never be served alongside a white fish preparation. Tennessee winery. I said. About 40 minutes east. They've been open since my daughter was in middle school. Philippe set the glass down, the way you set something down, when you've already decided it isn't worth picking back up. How inventive. His wife Sylviane smiled at me from across the arrangement of wildflowers. Cassie had spent 3 evenings assembling in mason jars. The smile was patient. Specific. The kind of smile a woman gives a golden retriever who has just done a very ordinary trick. And remind me, Dale, your work is in construction. Contracting. I said. Custom homes. Mostly. I also own about 90 acres of commercial property off the county highway. How industrious, Sylviane said, and returned to her wine. Industrious. Like I'd told her, I alphabetized my toolbox. I let it settle. I let it go. Cassie had her hand over Renaud's on the table, laughing at something he'd said about the bread. And that right there, that easy, unguarded laugh she's had since she was 4 years old, was worth every small condescension these two could manufacture over a plate of grilled trout. I've been in tight spots. I slept in my work van for 11 days between jobs at 26 because I was too hard-headed to ask my older brother for a loan. I know how to smile through things. You learn it early if you grow up having to earn everything twice as hard as the people who started with more. What I hadn't anticipated was for them to think I wasn't even in the room. Here's what nobody at that table knew about me. Not Renaud. Not his parents. Not even Cassie, not fully. When I was 23. Before I'd started the business. Before the land. Before any of it. I spent 3.5 years doing infrastructure work overseas. Southern Belgium and the northern stretches of France. Mostly. Arras. Lens. One long winter outside Calais. I didn't learn the language from a classroom. I learned it from job site arguments and long lunches, and a foreman named Gerard who had exactly zero tolerance for a young American who nodded without understanding. You pick it up fast when the alternative is getting hurt. I came home fluent, and I came home quiet about it. Because nobody on a roofing crew in Hartwell, Tennessee needs to know you can read a French building code. It never came up. It never mattered. Until it did, somewhere between the appetizers and the entrees. Philippe leaned toward Sylviane and said something close and low. A small laugh at the end of it. And Sylviane comfortable. Certaine. Safe in the belief that she was speaking inside a sealed room, answered him in French. The way you'd answer someone in your kitchen at home? I kept my eyes on my plate. Kept my fork moving. Kept listening. They started with Cassie's dress. Sylviane said it was charming for something bought ready-made. Emphasis on ready-made. Then Philippe did an imitation of the way I'd mispronounced charcuterie when we'd ordered the starter board. And Sylviane laughed into her napkin. Quiet and pleased with herself. Small cruelties. The kind that sting and then fade if you let them. But then Sylviane glanced toward the far wall of the restaurant, where Copperstone Grill had a rotating display of local artisan work furniture. Ironwork. That sort of thing. A habit of the owners, featuring craftsmen from around the county. And there, mounted in a simple frame under glass, was a photograph. A bookcase. My bookcase. The one I'd built for Cassie's bedroom when she was 9. From reclaimed timber, salvaged out of a barn we'd torn down to build the addition on the house. I'd spent 11 weekends on that piece. Fitted joints. Hand-sanded shelves. Oil finish. I'd mixed myself to match the warmth of the existing floor. Cassie kept her spelling bee trophies on the bottom shelf until she left for college. The restaurant owner had asked to feature the photo 2 years ago, and I'd said yes without thinking much of it. Sylviane tilted her head at the photograph and said quiet, "Caswell, the way you say something you've said 100 times before, he probably dragged it out of someone's garage. Americans mistake age for craftsmanship. They put old wood on a wall and call it an heirloom." I set my knife down. Not hard. Not dramatically. Just down. The way you set a tool down when you're deciding whether to keep working or stop for the day. Deliberate. Quiet. She's looking at 11 weekends of my life and calling it salvage. Nobody else at that table noticed the shift. Cassie was scrolling something on her phone under the table. Smiling. Renaud was refilling his water. Philippe sat back with his wine. Satisfied. Like a man who had just made a joke in a language only, he spoke. Except he wasn't the only one. I looked up. Philippe caught my eye the briefest test, checking whether the American had tracked anything. I smiled at him. Open. Easy. Varm. The smile that says everything's fine here. You know, I said in English, folding my hands on the edge of the table. I've always thought you can tell more about a person by what they build than by anything they buy. Don't you find that? Philippe blinked once. Of course. Certainly. Good. I said. I'd hate for anyone here to get confused about the difference between something that lasts and something that just looks expensive. I let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough to mean something. Not long enough to be a fight. I heard you. And you have no idea I did. That should have been the worst of the evening. It wasn't. 20 minutes later. Dessert plates pushed aside. Sylviane leaned toward Renaud, not toward Philippe. Toward her own son, and asked in French, casual as asking about the drive home, "Are the documents prepared?" Renaud answered without looking up from his espresso. Almost. Week after next. I think. I kept my face pleasant, interested in my coffee, turning nothing over. What documents week after next means before the wedding. I didn't get the rest of it that night. It came in pieces over the days that followed. The way important things usually do. But I got enough. I heard a name, Renaud Fontaine, holding, and I caught a phrase from Philippe that turned something cold in the center of my chest, in a way that Sylviane's comment about the bookcase never quite reached. Le beau-père est tellement facile à manœuvrer. The father-in-law is so easy to manage. And then Renaud, the man who had sat across from me 4 months ago with actual tears in his eyes asking for my blessing to marry my daughter, laughed. Actually laughed. And said, in French, without lowering his voice even slightly, he wants Cassie to be happy more than he wants to protect himself. I told you he'd go along with anything. He won't read the fine print. Then, smooth as a switch flipping, he turned to Cassie in English, took her hand across the table, and said, "Best night. Baba. You doing okay? The best," Cassie said, and leaned her head against his shoulder. He is not marrying my daughter. He is performing marrying my daughter. And I just sat through the dress rehearsal. I paid the check. Cash. Full tip. Shook every hand at the valet stand. Told Sylviane what a wonderful evening it had been. I drove home in my truck the long way, the one that winds past the old mill pond. I sat in my own driveway for a long time before I got out. Cassie texted while I was still sitting there. Dad, tonight meant so much. Thank you for trying so hard with them. She has no idea what she's thanking me for. But she will, and I want the truth to reach her before that ring does. I called a man named Warren Briggs, someone I'd met during a commercial construction project in my late 20s. A man who now ran a corporate risk firm out of Nashville and knew how to find things people went to considerable effort to bury. It was close to midnight. He picked up. Withers. It's been a while. I need a favor, I said, and I need you to be very good at it. 2 days later, I made a phone call that changed the shape of everything. The morning after the dinner, I called Cassie and suggested that Philippe and Sylviane move out of their hotel and into my guest house for the rest of their stay. Save them the commute. Let them really get comfortable. There was a pause. Dad, are you sure? I know last night was a lot. More than you know. Molly, I want this to work, I said. And every word was true, just not in the direction she thought. Let me do this. The relief in her voice when she agreed was the loneliest sound I'd heard in years. They moved in that Wednesday. And for the better part of 10 days, I was the most agreeable man in Hartwell, Tennessee. I asked Sylviane about her garden. I let Philippe explain to me why the cut of my back porch wasn't draining correctly. I smiled. I nodded. I cataloged every word. Thursday night after they'd turned in, I pulled out of my driveway slowly and called Warren from the road. Talk to me, I said. Warren didn't soften it. Philippe Fontaine's import company is effectively insolvent. They filed for restructuring in France 14 months ago, and it didn't hold. There are liens on the family property going back further than that. Real numbers. Dale. The kind that don't get cleared by selling off the wine cellar. I gripped the wheel. And Renaud, active civil suite in France. A business venture that collapsed and took 6 investors with it. Nothing criminal. But it's not nothing. And your daughter doesn't know any of it. Not one word. I sat in the dark outside a gas station on Route 9. Engine idling. There's more, Warren said. This trust arrangement they're proposing, the one they're framing as estate planning, it's not estate planning. If they get your commercial acreage into a jointly structured trust, that land becomes collateral for Philippe's European debt. The offshore lenders have first claim. You sign it. You've handed them a lifeline and called it a wedding gift. I called my attorney, Roger Callahan, from the driveway when I got home. Read him 3 sentences from the document they'd slid into my hands over brunch that Sunday. Roger went quiet in a way that told me everything before he spoke. Dale. This is a cross-collateralization agreement with an offshore entity. Your land isn't going into a trust. It's going up as security for Philippe Fontaine's foreign creditors. There it is. They didn't fly across an ocean to join my family. They flew across an ocean because I own something they need. They brought the trust paperwork to me on a Sunday morning. Philippe in his lean shirt. Sylviane with her coffee. Both of them casual and warm. Philippe framing it as what families do in Europe: consolidate, protect, plan ahead. I scratched my jaw. Said it sounded like a lot for a simple builder to get his head around. Asked them to have their attorneys send the final draft directly to me, and I'd look it over. I watched the quiet gleam of certainty cross Philippe's face. He thought he'd set the hook. That night I sat with Roger for 3 hours in my study, building the counter document. Grant sent over translated, notarized records of Philippe's liens. Renaud's lawsuit. The exact clauses in the trust that would have handed my land to creditors in another country. Airtight. Every page dated and verified. 2 mornings later, I found Philippe on my back porch with his coffee, looking over my property the way a man looks at something he's already started spending in his head. Morning, I said, sitting down across from him. I read through that folder last night. I want to do this right, have my family attorney draft a clean, updated document that everyone can actually read. And we sign it together at the rehearsal dinner in front of the whole family. Make it official. Make it real. I watched it land. The flicker of surprise. The smoothing over. The private satisfaction he thought he was hiding. A signing in front of everyone. Perfect. That's a wonderful idea. Dale, he said. Very meaningful. You have no idea how meaningful. The rehearsal dinner was a Saturday in late August. String lights threaded through the oaks I'd planted the year Cassie was born. Long tables on the back patio. White linen. Mason jars packed with black-eyed Susans and whatever else had come up wild along the fence line that summer. 40 people. Grilled trout. Virginia ham biscuits. Good wine from the case I'd bought specifically for this night. Philippe and Sylviane held court near the head of the table. Champagne flutes in hand. That easy. Patronizing grace about them that I recognized now as people who believed they had already won. Roger was there too. Off to the side in a sport coat. Looking like any other family friend. Holding nothing more conspicuous than a glass of water. He caught my eye once. Small nod. Ready. I looked at Cassie. She was laughing with her college friends near the dessert table. Her rehearsal dinner dress catching the string lights. The happiest I'd seen her in longer than I could name. I'm sorry. Sweetheart, what I'm about to do is going to cost you something tonight that you can't get back. But it's going to save you something you can't afford to lose. I tapped my ring against my glass. The conversation dropped off one table at a time until the only sound left was crickets and a single light bulb buzzing somewhere in the trees. If everyone could give me just a minute. I said, I won't keep you from the trout too long. That got a laugh. Good. Let them stay warm. Let them stay loose just a little while longer. Most of you know I'm not much for speeches. I said, I'd rather be up on a roof than up here with all of you looking at me. Another laugh. Cassie beamed at me. I felt the weight of what was coming settle in my chest. Heavy and necessary. Cassie, I said, turning toward her. You are the best thing I've ever built. And I've built some things I'm proud of. I let that breathe for a second. I turned to Philippe and Sylviane. And I want to thank our guests for coming all this way. That's not a small thing. Flying across an ocean for people you barely know. Philippe dipped his head. Gracious. Practiced. The pleasure is entirely ours. Dale. I'm sure it is. I said. Something in my tone made Sylviane's smile shift at the edges the way a draft moves under a door you thought was sealed. Since our guests traveled such a distance, I said, my voice still easy, still level. I thought it only right to honor them in their language, especially since they've spent the last several weeks assuming I didn't speak a word of it. I watched the color begin to leave Philippe's face. I switched to French. 25 years of quiet. And it came out sharp and clean, as the first morning I'd used it on a job site outside Calais. I watched Philippe's glass stop halfway to his mouth. Sylviane went rigid. Absolutely still. For 3 weeks. I said, you spoke about my daughter like she was an asset on a balance sheet. You laughed at my work. You insulted my home. You called her predictable while you were planning to use her wedding to steal my land. Renaud pushed back from his chair, his face going red. Dale. Stop, Renaud, I said. And something in my voice made him stop the way a man stops when he realizes he's standing somewhere dangerous. Sit down. I switched back to English. I heard every word. 40 faces turned. First toward Philippe and Sylviane, then toward me, then slowly, quietly, toward Cassie, whose expression had moved through confusion and arrived somewhere else, somewhere I recognized as the moment when a person realizes that everything they thought was solid is not solid at all. "Dad," she said, her voice small. "What?" "I'm sorry." "Sweetheart," I said, and I meant it in a way I hadn't meant anything in years. "I didn't want you to find out like this, but I couldn't let you find out after the wedding either." Roger came forward and handed me the folder. Same style of leather folder Philippe had slid across my porch table 2 Sundays ago. Except everything inside this one was true. 2 weeks ago, I said, opening it flat on the table so the people nearest could see. Philippe and Sylviane presented me with what they called a family trust, an estate planning gift, a way to officially welcome my family into theirs. I flipped to the first page. What it actually is, I said, is a transfer of my commercial property into an offshore holding entity controlled entirely by Philippe Fontaine, an entity that his creditors have first legal claim against. Someone down the table made a sound. Cassie's college roommate pressed her hand to her mouth. "Philippe's company in France," I said, turning another page, "has been insolvent for over a year. There are liens against the family estate in Normandy going back further than that. Real numbers. The kind you don't clear by selling off the furniture." I looked at Renaud now. Not with anger, with something quieter and worse. And Renaud has an active civil lawsuit against him in France for a failed business venture that collapsed and took 6 investors with it. Not one word of which he has ever mentioned to the woman he's supposed to be marrying in 2 weeks. "That is not," Renaud started, half rising. "I'm not finished," I said. He sat back down. Cassie was staring at him now. Waiting. The way you wait for someone to say the one true thing that either makes everything okay or confirms the worst thing you've ever thought. Renaud's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "Cassie," he said, "it's not what it looks like." She pulled the ring off her finger without rushing. Set it on the table in front of him. "Deliberate. Without drama. You made me a pawn," she said. Her voice was calmer than I expected, colder than I'd ever heard from her. "You laughed at my father's work. You called me predictable." She stood, and instead of turning away, instead of stepping back from the table the way anyone might have been forgiven for doing, she walked around to where I was standing. She didn't take cover behind me. She stood beside me, shoulder to shoulder, her jaw set, her eyes clear. "That's my girl." I reached back into the folder and handed Renaud a second document. "That's an itemized statement of every expense your family has incurred during your stay in my guest house," I said, "and a formal notice that the property needs to be vacated by tomorrow morning." Philippe found his voice, thin and brittle, the way expensive things sound when they crack. "Dale. Surely we can. We discussed everything we needed to discuss," I said, in 2 languages. Apparently, I just didn't participate until now. I picked up the champagne glass I'd been holding since the start of the evening, took a slow sip, set it back down on the table with a quiet, deliberate click. "Philippe," I said, "I paid for tonight's dinner out of my contractor's bank account. You're welcome. Though we both know that's not what you mean when you say it." I gestured toward the guest house across the yard. Same building I'd put up with my own hands the summer I built that bookcase. The one Sylviane had called a garage find. "The guest house is unlocked," I said. "You're welcome to stay one more night. But I'd recommend calling a hotel. The breakfast will be better." Nobody said a word. Philippe's jaw worked like a man trying to remember the lines of a speech he'd been sure he wouldn't need. But there was nothing left to say. Not with the folder open on the table. Not with his own son's words handed back to him in the very language he thought had made him untouchable. I looked at Cassie. She looked up at me, eyes wet but jaw steady. "You ready?" I asked her. Quiet. Just for her. She nodded. Together, we walked away from the table. Past the string lights, past the wildflowers in their mason jars, past 40 stunned faces and one open folder that had just unraveled a con. 2 people had flown 4,000 miles to finish. Behind us, I heard Sylvian's voice rise, calling after us, high and desperate and reaching for something she had already lost. I didn't turn around. I had heard everything I needed to hear from that family the first night, over white fish and a glass of Tennessee wine, in a language they were certain was a locked door. You were wrong about a lot of things, Philippe, but you were most wrong about that. Cassie slipped her hand into mine as we walked toward the house, the same way she used to, when she was small enough to hand me screws from a mason jar lid and call it helping. Thank you, Dad, she said quietly, for hearing what I couldn't. Always. Sweetheart, I said, every single word. Behind us, the string lights kept glowing over an empty table and an untouched toast and 2 people who had crossed an ocean to take something from us, and left with nothing but the sound of their own words. Finally understood.